We are live. Welcome, everybody. It's webinar time. A very special one for me. Of course, it's a Treasury Masterminds webinar. I'm the founder of Treasury Masterminds and I moderate all the sessions. But I'm also founder of Pecunia Treasury and Finance, which is the host of this session. So wearing two hats today, we're going to talk Treasury transformation. When do we need consultants, technology, or both? Very happy to have a very experienced panel here. Crystal Akam, founder and managing director of Prime Treasury Partners, and Mark Crowhurst, founder of Strategic Risk Partners. Both experienced treasury consultants, both in the Pecunia network, who will share their knowledge today about this topic. So let's dive straight into it. I want to ask the first question to Crystal, but the first question I'm going to ask, I also want to ask the audience here. Please come put your comments or your answers, comments, ideas in the chat, in the comments section, because we want to hear from you as well. We're discussing this topic with the three of us, but there are loads of people here as well. We had almost 100 people sign up to this webinar. So let's hear from you as well. So the first question is straight diving into it. What's the biggest treasury transformation mistake you keep seeing? Let's hear it from the audience in the chat. And while the audience is answering that, Crystal, what's your experience on this treasury transformation mistakes?
Yeah, I think the biggest mistake I sort of see is people buying technology before they've, really looked at their target operating model. So looking to the tech to be the solution first when you need to really have that framework in place, but also not having the right experience when implementing the changes as well.
And that's experience on the transformation side or in the treasury team? Crystal?
Sorry, Patrick, I lost connection for a sec. So that
okay.
was...
That was, you mentioned experience being one of the factors. You mean, is that experience on the transformation side? Is that treasury experience?
On the transformation side, because you may not always see the pitfalls that could happen when implementing. So, yeah, that's where I've seen it most.
Yeah, interesting. Mark, what's your take on treasury transformation failures?
I think the key thing is alignment for me. It's more about how you actually align the business and all the various component parts to actually buy into the transformation itself. So to me, it's really about aligning. A lot of it's around aligning stakeholders, aligning business users to buy into the treasury transformation itself. And I think that kind of links back to the fact that often, a transformation, it doesn't work if it's done in isolation. It needs the buy-in of operations teams, wider finance teams, risk teams, etc., to kind of focus in on what the transformation is about, buy into the value that the transformation is going to add, and then take it from there. And that to me is a real focus around what the planning phase should be. Planning isn't just about working out what your activities are and what your resources are and how they're going to fit together and how that's then going to align to what your technology is going to be delivering. It's also about making sure your business is aligned to what's going to happen. So that for me is let's call it the key thing. The other side of that then is any transformation requires data. For me it's around making sure that there's no point in embarking on a transformation that's going to provide you with let's pick an example, better cash flow forecasting, better liquidity management. If the data that underpins that particular project is a mess, you're better off kind of focusing on getting it to a level. And I think a lot of people aim for perfection. It should be good enough. You're never going to get perfection out of data. It's about getting the data to a level that's good enough with your stakeholders bought in, and then that gives you a nice base, or the best base, to start moving forward. I think that's it. And I think as somebody's obviously commented here as well, it's also about the time. Whatever time you've estimated for your transformation, double it.
Okay.
As a basic rule of thumb, I think in my experience,
Yes.
and that's doubling it around, not just the transformation itself, but again, it's the final buy-in. It's about bringing those business users along the journey, not just the treasury ones, as I've said. It's about bringing all those business users along that journey, and also when it beds in until you're kind of, let's call it, in happy state, which is not going to occur immediately. The transformation takes place, but likely to be a few months, possibly a year after the transformation has taken place, when you see the true value of it. And I think that requires patience, and of course that then links back to making sure you're focused on the alignment of stakeholders.
No, makes sense. To be honest, I've done a few transformations. None of them were fully on time. They were all later, to be honest. And that's a nice topic to or bridge to the next topic. When should companies hire a consultant? What would usually be the trigger to hire a consultant for a treasury transformation project? Is it capacity? I don't. Let me not answer the question. Crystal, what's usually the trigger where clients come to you to ask them, help me out?
Usually, I'd say a gap in expertise. Usually, when you're in the day-to-day problems, you kind of can't see the bigger picture, as it were. So you kind of have lots of people with expertise in front, middle, back, but they haven't got that strategic overlay, or they came into treasury later in the day, so they've not had that grounding level. So it's kind of really that overarching understanding. You've had industry experience, you've done this 10 times over in the industry, whereas you being in an advisory capacity, whereas or more, obviously, especially for Mark. But it's kind of having that gap. You really do need to have the expertise involved. I feel that's when you need consultants.
Yeah. Mark, going a bit deeper on that, I talk to a lot of treasury teams. I often feel treasury teams are generally understaffed, fairly small, doing a lot with limited people. Of course, that's nice for the CFO. The treasury team is not very expensive. Few people doing a lot of cool treasury stuff. But where's the point where internal capacity becomes a limitation rather than a cost saving, because treasury is always a cost center somehow. Obviously not a profit center, but there's a fine line between those.
I think a lot of that is around, it's what value. So I think to me, it's about value that's being added to the business. So I think picking up on that, to my mind, I don't think necessarily consulting is about adding capacity. I think picking up on what Crystal said, it's really about adding experience, judgment, and challenge. That challenge and judgment comes through obviously expertise. So to me, I think where you end up with a situation where where that becomes a limitation, it's where that department itself is not adding expertise, be that around advising a CFO on what they might choose to do with their surplus cash, providing the CFO with enough information around where there are liquidity spikes and cash flows that they need to be aware of, talking around stresses, that side of things, and also making sure obviously that the operational risks of running a treasury, be that in terms of let's call it the operational aspects of managing the debt, or the operational aspects of managing anything to do with market risk, credit risk, or liquidity risk. Those to me are the fundamentals, and that's where the expertise and the judgment comes in, because to my mind, a treasury team should be providing quality advice to a CFO to enable them to function on the economic side. So the accounting side to me is, CFO will have that covered, but really it's about understanding those economic aspects of a business and how a treasury can add value to that. And if it's not adding that value, then it's a limitation.
Yeah, Yeah. No, I like what Tamara is saying there in the chat. The trigger to hire consultants, lack of resources, like you already mentioned. But there's also the operational treasury, which still needs to go on day to day. And if your operations already are like 80-90% of your capacity, then suddenly a transformation is a side quest. We'll do that when the operations are finished. That's not how a transformation should work. Then it definitely takes too long, and it does never get the priority it should get. But let's dive deeper into that. Let's make it concrete. Which projects would generally benefit?
I think a lot of that's about, because ultimately, the business moving forward. Sorry, slightly. So I was going to say, I think ultimately the business needs to own the transformation going forward. So to my mind, the idea is then to take people out of the operational aspect and involve them in the transformation, and that's a backfill. Now that to me isn't necessarily a consulting role. I'll go back to the point. If it's about capacity, I think you might be better off looking at contractors rather than necessarily a consultant. But it depends on the nature of that backfill role and for how long.
Yeah.
And whether that's tied to the overall kind of transformation itself.
Yeah. Of course, it can go both ways. If you hire a contractor to save up the team doing less operational work, then the team can be more involved in doing transformational work. But that comes back to what you said, Mark. You need someone who has the expertise. The average treasurer has maybe done one transformation project. You and Crystal, they have a whole list of transformations you have already done. So you're probably better off doing them. Yeah. No, agree. So which projects generally benefit from external expertise the most? Let's make that concrete examples. Crystal, what transformations have you done?
So I think definitely TMS implementation. So from early on, like in an RFP process, because it's not just about how it's implemented after, it's also getting the right system fit for purpose for the company. And people tend to go on hearsay, I've heard about this one, but it may be too much for them to use. They may not use all of it. So I think that's definitely one area. The cash optimization as well, definitely key, because you can literally through the savings of that you can pay for the work that's being done by consultants. So and then I think having that bigger picture from a if it's not centralized or they've not seen it centralized before as well, when they're small, when they're growing bigger, they kind of need to really relook at that, how they can structure. But sometimes you just need that kind of expertise and advice in, as myself and Mark have seen broader experience of different industries and different setups depending on the type of business you're in. So there's some of the areas that I feel. Yeah,
makes sense. Mark, anything to add?
Yeah, I think the key thing for me is, I think as Crystal mentioned there, it's about, frankly, a treasury consultant can pay for themselves several times over. I mean, I've just recently done a project whereby, they had a lot of surplus cash, particularly on the client money side, where they were really only using one source of kind of, let's call it, revenue generation. And actually, it's a bit like your own money. I mean, if you've got your own money, you can leave it in the bank that pays you the lowest savings rate. Well, you're not. You're probably going to kind of move it to something else. And if you don't need that money for 6 months, you might put it in a longer term account. Now, where you're dealing with certain types of money, you obviously need it to be as close to risk free as you can get. So once you've kind of supported the CFO, the board, to understand the risks involved of actually diversifying surplus cash across various other counterparties, and you've got them comfortable with those counterparties, you can actually really generate a lot of revenue for an organization by using that surplus cash in a much more revenue generating. I take your point around a cost center, but I do think a treasury can be and should be a revenue center. And a good treasurer with the right expertise will know how to make revenue off of treasury money or surplus cash, in the right way, as well as obviously save money on the debt side as well, because they'll be experienced enough to understand the way in which the markets are moving, understand how they might choose to raise cash and in what form that might look like as well. So to me, that's the real value. And then if I link back into things like, okay, cash flow forecasting, well, that's all about, okay, we talked a little bit earlier about the data, but if you've got good enough data and you can start to look at that and model it out, again, what that gives you is the ability to understand where those peaks and troughs are. It enables you to understand where you might need to raise cash from the debt side and when you might need to intervene earlier, which allows you an earlier conversation and a better conversation. Or it allows you then to kind of take that surplus and invest it over a particular period of time to generate additional revenue for you and the company. And that to me is where a kind of real value is. Obviously, there are values, as I think we've discussed earlier, around how expertise and judgment around things like a transformation project, how we can provide value around things like, and I wouldn't necessarily use the phrase bank rationalisation, because I don't think bank rationalisation is always the answer. I think it's about finding the right strategic bank partners, and that might mean having less. It might equally mean having more, because to my earlier point around surplus liquidity, you may only have one bank. So actually you might want a choice of a panel of 5 or 6 to place your money with. And that's all about that adding value, which again, I'll always come back to the core pillars for me around expertise, judgment and challenge, which is what any consultant worth their salt, as it were, should be bringing to the table.
Yeah, no, I fully agree here, Mark, fully agree. Of course, Pecunia does a lot of projects. I think in almost half of them, we add so much value, especially the consulting projects. We make more money for the client than we have cost. And of course, upfront, it's hard to really calculate the ROI of a project upfront. But in Treasury, it often means transformation means a better Treasury than before. Means you saved money somewhere, you reduced risk somewhere, you optimized returns, and I love doing those because then you can 6 months in, 9 months in, 12 months in, tell the client, remember how you did this 12 months ago, it was less efficient, it was more expensive, now it's cheap, now it's automated, now you have control, you have visibility of cash. Sometimes it's all about visibility, reducing the risk, amazing projects. Great. Is there anything a company should solve internally before they bring in a consultant, Mark?
I think again it comes back to some of the earlier conversation around transformation. To me, it's about we spoke a little bit earlier about aligning the business. So there's no point in bringing the consultants if you've not got the right sponsorship in place. That okay, a consultant can help align business users and stakeholders, but ultimately you want them there or thereabouts before you've got to bring in a consultant to kind of finish the job off. The other side as well is about clear ownership of the process and data. Understanding who does what within an organisation. Again, a consultant can help with that process, but you at least want that politics side of it dealt with, and that of course links back to understanding the right business owners and who's involved in the project, as well as agreeing on the priorities. It shouldn't be the job of a consultant to mediate the politics. Ultimately, the sponsor and those business users should understand what are the priorities of this project, how should we take it forward, and as I say, that links back to sponsorship. It links back to understanding, getting the business users on side and understanding who owns those process and data. And also the other side, and frankly, from a company perspective, that they really need basic documentation in place. There's no point in me coming in and spending my first couple of weeks basically reproducing documentation that really should be there. You really want to apply the expertise of someone like myself and Crystal to the design, not to discovery. Ideally that should already be in place. And of course, it's not going to be perfect, and it will need to be enhanced, but it really should be there to kind of start the journey, so to speak. Those are the kind of things that I think that should be there, kind of resolved internally first.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, they rarely are, I should say. In an ideal world,
I was about to ask, Crystal, is it always this way? Probably not.
Yeah.
No, I think I think
they procedures or policies.
Realize there's not a framework in place, and then go, okay, let's have a look at this properly, because it's understandable when people are growing or they've you know, branched across from other industries. It may be different, I understand that, but yeah, you really need to have that, you know, who owns the problems, as Mark's alluded to, what we're trying to solve, and what's the successful outcome from this. You know, we can sort of help bring that expertise and challenge the way things are being done, and helping, as Mark says, you end up actually helping along the way as well. But you know, we can't replace, you know, the leadership. They need to own that position. But yeah, it may start at something like, oh, let's do a TMS, but actually let's go back to target operating model. You know, because I feel like hearing what we've heard, or depending on what the situation the client's in, it can be, oh, actually, I really think we need to iron this out before, because what will happen is you'll bring those problems to the RFP process, and you know, as kind of said, you expect them to kind of tell us what you need, what I need, you know, and it needs to be, you know, what you need, you know what requirements are, so you can ask the right questions to vendors, whether that be in technology, but also in banking as well. Mark talking about bank rationalization, you know, your panel of banking partners, you know, have you got the right areas, especially when it comes to insurance? Have you got your sanctions bank, you know, have you got, especially on the operational side, you know, that can really change things up, and for various local regulatory reasons you'll need a local bank. But yeah, just making sure for cash pooling, have you got the right bank that's got the exposure globally, if you can, or regionally? It just depends on the situation, of course. But yeah, we really, yeah, unfortunately it's never straightforward, as ever, but that's what we're here for, right?
Not sure if you should say unfortunately. Yeah, that makes consulting quite fun.
It's more, it would be, it's a nice to have, isn't it, if someone's in the, but then yeah, that's kind of why we do what we do, because we see those gaps and the needs, right? So that's why, obviously, I love doing what I do, because I love helping people out, and I want to see it better for them and thrive. But yeah, it just depends on the situations, but that's part of the challenge, right? I love a bit of a challenge. So
exactly, that's great motivation to start from. But I can only confirm, Crystal, Mark, what you're saying. I talk to many treasurers on a weekly basis via Pecunia, and sometimes they start, I don't want to say wrong question, but from an angle which is probably step 3 or 4. Patrick, which TMS should we buy? Which is a weird question to answer without knowing anything about the company. Or, hey, Patrick, we should really go into AI. Where should I start? I'm like, that's probably step 4, 5, 6. We should start with, where's the biggest problem in your treasury? Where are you doing things manually? Where are the bottlenecks? Where do you see information gaps? To what Meester is saying in the chat. Sometimes it's an IT issue, but Treasury is hurt by it, so we need to solve IT issues. I feel like the modern treasury consultant now, compared to 10 years ago, is much more IT skilled now than we needed to be 10 years ago. Which is a great bridge towards going into the technology question, because we're talking transformation about consulting versus technology. 10 years ago, treasurers built Excel models because they were Excel nerds and good at it and had the skills. I think AI can do a lot of it now. Question mark to be discussed. Where's consulting value moving today? What's your opinion, Mark?
I think the value today is about understanding the landscape. And again, I'll come back to, you know, my twin pillars of expertise and judgment. So where's it moving to? I don't think, you know, the 2 pillars will change ever. I think the question is where is the landscape moving to? So where the landscape's moving to is, of course, you know, we all, you know, love to hear the word AI, because AI is going to solve all our problems. And I think ultimately it will solve a lot of, let's call it, basic things. You know, for example, you know, I can become an Excel whiz using AI, because I just prompt AI on Excel on Copilot, and it tells me how to do a whole bunch of things and formulas and other things. And, you know, if I prompt it in the right way, it will enable you to do lots of modeling that, you know, people have spent an awful lot of time learning. So, technology, I think the way in which we use technology, I think is changing as consultants. So for me, it's about how I apply my expertise and knowledge to technology. So how do I interrogate an Excel model or support a client maybe in building an Excel model? Because frankly, as we all know, Excel is probably the most common treasury tool used by all our clients. So how do I apply my expertise to improve what they do? How do I actually use AI to interrogate their Excel model in such a way that I can look for gaps within it? I've done that with it before. I'm frankly a bit of a beginner on Excel, but on AI, I know the right prompts to ask. Equally, when I'm looking at things like documentation and other things, right? I can use it for things like stress testing. And for me, it's then about not just accepting the results, but how do I prompt it in the right way and apply my judgment to what comes out the other end of it, so it isn't just rubbish, which is what a lot of it produces. I think I found, in certain industries and certain individuals rely upon whatever AI says as de facto the right answer. Of course, it isn't. You might not prompt it in the right way, and B, it will spew out a load of other information. It's just gathered through its own pouring across databases. You need to apply judgment to it. So I think the way in which our role is changing as Treasury consultants is understanding how to use the new technologies around us. It's also understanding that we live in a world where we want all our systems to be connected to each other as well. How do we build that infrastructure? And I say systems, I mean that in its widest sense. I don't just mean IT, I mean business systems, business processes, data. How do we link all that together? And I think that's becoming more and more important, particularly data, because I go back to the cash flow model. Again, I'll repeat myself, but it's about getting that data good enough. How does that data get built? What can I do as a Treasury consultant to support that process? Well, I can help understand. Have I got the right lineage? Where are my data sources? Is it the golden source? If it isn't, what do we do about it? How do we challenge that? Right? How do we make sure that we've got the right information around that? How do I then support that in helping my client identify the right technology to solve the problem? And I think that comes back to a point that Crystal just made in the last conversation, which was the problem. And hopefully everybody agrees on that problem. Because often what you end up doing is, your IT gets delivered and it solves a completely different problem. A problem that nobody asked, but you just happen to like the vendor. So it's about, providing, again, that judgment and power around the technology, because there's so much out there. How do you actually, find your way through that landscape to find the right technology solution that will solve the problem that you collectively agree is your problem? Not a lovely piece of flashy looking technology sold by a great salesperson that solves a problem that you don't actually have, but your existing problem still exists. And that's something you end up seeing quite often, whereby people will pick a nice piece of technology because they do a great sales job, but actually it doesn't solve the underlying problem that you had in the first place. Yes. So I think that's where I see the consultant is around, how do we support, the use of things like AI? How do we support, client understanding data better? How do we help a client navigate the complex landscape that is technology today, particularly when you've got a lot of technology vendors, as they do, kind of consolidating and pulling their various platforms together, most of which don't integrate because they've left them separately within the company anyway.
Yeah, but that's an amazing point there.
So that's my view about how it kind of links across.
Yeah. So to summarize a bit what you're saying, Mark, technology doesn't replace consultants. AI definitely not yet. It replaces the low value consulting in the automation part. It doesn't replace our brains, our expertise, our many years of I've seen that before, or this isn't the right question to ask. I am triggered by the fact that you say, okay, some technologies do disappoint, and it's not easy to select the right tool. Technology is not always the solution, but we do need technology sometimes to get ahead. TMSs are wonderful solutions. So, Crystal, why do some Treasury software selections disappoint? Is it market transparency? Is it the requirements? I don't want to fill in your answer again, but quite curious what you are seeing.
I think it's kind of a bit at the end of what Mark said, really, but it's, they've decided to go with software, but they've not it may not be solving their problem. Obviously, as you say, TMS is a huge enabler of that decision making, and you need to get it right. Yeah. But if they don't know the fundamentals of how it works, and if it's going to work for if you've got more than 5 to 6 banks, is it capable of, say if you've got 100 odd banks, is it capable of managing those messages? Does it have the right connection points? Is it on Swift? Do you not? There's so many variables, I would say, and people kind of said, people just go with one because, oh, I heard they're good, which is great because you've got really small, medium, and large scale TMS vendors, right? So there's a reason why you have different variation in sizes, is because of the different capabilities. It might be that you're doing light touch cash management, or you might be in a financial services where you need the biggest, vendor or vendors. There's more than one vendor, but you need the bigger vendors, as it were, to fill those needs, because you've got a huge risk element and different types, with loans as well. That's a huge thing. But also just having that different modules to manage things into one place. You don't want to have to add on or bolt on more systems, right? So I think it just goes back to understanding your requirements, making sure you do a fair process. It needs to be unbiased, not just because, oh, I like them, so we'll go with them. So and making sure that you really challenge those vendors in what your requirements are, and sandbox. Tell you what, the best thing I've done before is say, right, they're so close, both give me a sandbox access, and then we've made it. It was quite close, but one was just slightly better on a couple of different areas, so they won it. But it's sort of, you kind of, each case is different, but I think, yeah, you've really got to go in with that knowledge and understanding of what you need and how it's going to solve it.
Yeah. No. Mark.
I don't think a lot of that is, I think, Chris, to pick up what you said, I think ultimately, it's about making sure things like those requirements are not vague, that they're clear and well defined, they're not politically shaped, which is often the case, that they need to be very clear about defining the business needs. I think the other challenge is, of course, things like vendors often try and influence the narrative as opposed to business driving it. I think that's always a problem back to the salesperson, that obviously aren't doing their job. And I think also it's about the role of us, is about enabling the organisation to compare the solutions that solve the problem that's there. I think often what happens is, I've seen organisations that show me their vendor list, and I think these are completely different solutions. They're going to solve different problems. What is the problem that you're solving? How do you do that? And that goes back to, something like an RFP. It's about defining your problem first and what value you want to get out of it, not necessarily the features. That's the secondary part. Once you all agree what the problem is you're solving, what you want the solution to deliver and the value it should be delivering, then you start to think about the features. And then, to Crystal's, there, you might use something like Treasury Delta, a very, very useful tool, to go through the first process, which is around making sure I kind of get a list of a level playing field. So once I've identified that problem and the value I want out of it, I'll go out to the vendors that I know. I'll select a number of them. I'll use something like a Treasury Delta really just to kind of help me level set around, the requirements that I've clearly defined. I want some ballpark pricing, so I probably won't use the actual volumes, value figures there. I'll just use it so I can get a level set across that. That enables me to go to the client with the first step, which is, this is what your landscape looks like. These are what the vendors can deliver for you by way of a high level set of requirements. This is what the pricing starts to look like. And then once I've got that, I can have a sensible conversation with them around how do we then restrict that list and bring some in front of you, because your time is valuable. I don't want to put 5, 10 vendors in front of you. I want to put maybe 2 or 3. And then I can put those 2 or 3 vendors in front of you. You can have a good conversation with them. I might provide them with some of your data first, that I've cleansed and sanitized, so they can then provide a more meaningful vendor presentation. And then to Crystal's point, I might then take, let's call it the final 2 away. I might start to negotiate with them, and get them to provide, us, and I mean the royal us as it were. So in terms of the client plus me, a sandbox to kind of to play with, so I get a real feel of it. So that when I make that decision, I've been through a very robust process that tells me, okay, this is my funnel of what all the vendors are out there that will solve your problem and deliver your value. What are the ones that we collectively believe and you have decided should be in front of you? And what are the final two that you think we should assess and you get comfortable with from a user perspective, from a functionality perspective, that are solving your problem and delivering you value?
Yeah.
So that's where I think focus right now.
No, I tend to agree a lot on this, Mark, and maybe a bold statement, but I do see clients undervaluing the time spent or needed to do a proper RFP, because they think, okay, we do a treasury transformation, it needs tech, they're already in the implementation phase in their head, we need the tech, so let's do the selection quickly because we need the tech to do the transformation. But the important part is actually the selection, like you say, because if I select the wrong tool, I end up doing a half implementation, which shouldn't be with the wrong tool. So my advice, for what it's worth, overspend on the RFP, time-wise, not money-wise. An RFP doesn't have to be very expensive. Do a proper selection. It will help you in the implementation. It will help you solve your problems right there. So great additions here, Mark, Crystal. Just towards the audience.
I think a lot of it, sometimes you'll find. Sometimes you'll find a situation whereby a treasurer will come in and they'll just want to use the treasury system they used at their last place, which may have solved a completely different problem at their last place.
Exactly.
And that's what decided the solution here. And actually, it doesn't work for their new organisation because it's a little bit different, or has different problems. And they need to deliver different value.
Yeah. No, fully agree. Funny you say that. I had this exact discussion yesterday with a client who changed jobs and said it needs to be this tool. And I'm like, how can you say that? Because you don't even know the requirements in your new job. So having a fun discussion there. We're in the last 8 minutes of the webinar, so turning to the audience, if you have questions to these very experienced consultants, now is your time to ask them. We will come to your questions and we will prioritize them. I do see Macer asking a question. Now it's gone. So should we use consultants to conduct the TMS search and selection prior to a transformation project? Can we say that, Crystal? Chicken, egg, which one comes first?
Again, I think it just depends on your expertise. If you've got people in the team that, haven't done this before, I definitely recommend to get involved in the process from the very beginning. It really does add value. We know the pitfalls, we know the right questions to ask, and also really need to understand how things are set up. But yeah, I do feel it just depends. As I say, if it's myself and Mark in the situation, we'd pretty much know how to run it. We've done it enough times. But if you are in a company where you don't have enough resource or capacity or knowledge, then yeah, I think you should do that up front. Yeah.
Okay, great. I see a really nice question from Don there. Imagine you enter into fragmented international treasury environment. There are 20 priorities. You have capacity for not 20 priorities, so you cannot work on them all. So how do you distinguish operational cash management problems, longer term transformation agenda? What do we do first in the first 90 days? Great question.
To me and Mark, or both.
Right. I mean, to my mind, it's really about, okay, what's the priority of the organisation, right? So it's not so much about what I would prioritise. I mean, I would have a chat with the CFO. He's probably the most important person, the person that's employing me. So what is it they want? And a lot of the time, it's a question of, do I want to get a better handle on my cash? Do I know my cash is? Which is typically a data question. So then I'd want to understand what are the sources of my data? You know, how reliable are they? How accessible are they? Are they trapped somewhere? So, you know, question number one, if the CFO comes back and says, I just want to know where my money is so that I can make more of my money, or I can use it for debt, or I can invest the surplus. You know, that's one question, which is, I guess, the most common one I find. And that to me is, you know, is a question around data. And then, you know, once I've established that, my question is then, well, what, you know, once we've established what it looks like, well, let's then start to, back to my point around, you know, good enough, let's start to work out how we can think through the problem you're trying to resolve, which is to get better visibility over it so you can use that cash better. And that then comes back down to thinking through things like, you know, data, it's around, do you have people that, you know what they're doing? Is there clear, you know, clarity between process owners, you know, people in the business, people in different parts of the world that might own that cash? You know, do you have access to those bank accounts? Do you know all those bank accounts? You know, that to me is a series of questions. So first thing in my first 90 days is CFO, what's your problem? Second one, you know, and I'm picking the example of transparency. Okay, great. What's your data look like? Who owns that data? Where do I go to speak to them? Okay, are those data owners clear? Are the process owners clear? Do people know what they're doing? Do I have access to that trapped cash? And how can I start to kind of pull it all together? And again, I just need basic information to begin with before I can then start to think through how to resolve that problem longer term. And longer term is accessing that cash information, maybe pulling it into one place. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a pooling solution. It might just be something as basic as a spreadsheet. You send me all your spreadsheets in a standardized template. I'll put them all in one place. At least I start to get a picture of what's out there. And then I might look to do that in a more automated fashion using a TMS, maybe even using a bank. You know, bank pooling solutions can do this for me. I might use a virtual cash solution, whatever that might look like. Right? I can then start to think through that, how I might resolve it longer term.
Yeah.
But really, it's about doing the basics, as I say, in the first 90 days first.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. I think it does depend on the problems really, because as Mark says, you kind of need to analyze the data first, right? Can you see it? Is there visibility? You know, if there's already a TMS in place, you know, can we at least get some of that data that maybe not centralized in there as well? But yeah, it really just does depend on what their issues are to be solved. It's really understanding how the team's set up, what areas they're working on, what areas you'd like to work on, but we can't because we've not got the right expertise and resource yet. So it's really kind of making it scalable, short-term, medium-term, and long-term solutions. But yeah, definitely resonate with what Mark's saying there.
Okay, great. Final 2 minutes. I want to end them with a bang. I have 5 statements, which I'm going to tell you. I want short answers, agree, disagree, with maximum 1 or 2 sentences. Why? So no long stories. We want to get to all 5 of them. Let's start with you, Crystal. Statement 1, TMS implementations are mainly technology projects.
Not completely. So I think it's more the projects are enabled by the technology. So a lot of it is strategic in my mind. So it's an enabler. But yeah, there is. That's what I'm saying. Partially, there is a lot of obviously technology, but I think, you know, that is an enabler to do the decision making.
Yeah. Great, Mark. Next one for you. Most companies buy more treasury software than they need.
I think they buy less treasury software than they need.
So
I think a lot of the time I think. Yeah, so I disagree with you. I think they buy less. I think I think one of the great problems of Treasury, particularly, you know, for, let's call it an accounting-based CFO, is the fact they understand the accounting world and the value of accounting software, but I think they don't necessarily understand the true value that Treasury software can bring. And I think that's an area where, as consultants, we can support and demonstrate the economic value of introducing treasury software to an organisation.
Yeah.
And by that I mean something like a TMS, cash flow tools, cash forecasting tools, economic cash flow forecasting tools, I should say, as opposed to accounting cash flow forecasting tools, which are obviously a different beast.
Definitely.
This
is an amazing bridge to the next statement, Crystal. You should never issue an RFP without external help.
Depends. so if your team's done successful, TMS implementations or whatever the RFP is for, then go ahead, do it. But it's better to get independent consultant advice than selecting the wrong solution. So it's going to cost you more in the end. So.
Yeah, no, fair point. Final two. Mark, AI will reduce treasury consulting by X% in the coming decade.
Point I made earlier, I don't think it necessarily will. I think what it should do is enhance treasury consulting. I think what it should do is enable us to, as consultants, to use AI and help the client remove low value tasks such as data interrogations and the Excel side of things, those aspects. I think what it should do is bring to the fore our expertise by being able to challenge AI, being able to challenge the judgment, and being able to challenge those aspects around it, and provide the expertise that we bring through the years of experience that we have, and our ability to ask the right prompts of AI.
Yeah, fully agree. Great one. Final one, Crystal, for you. I'm a bit biased on this one, so I'm happy I only asked the question. So the big consulting firms, the big four, provide the best treasury advice.
I think it depends on their experience. So have they had industry experience? And that's where I find now more boutique firms are, having more expertise because they've been in the industry for decades, rather than just, have a lot of consultants in a meeting room because they've read about how to do it, rather than they've actually practically done it in theory, in literal. They know the theory, but they don't know how to physically do that. So I find nowadays, and just talking to clients as well, they found that it's not as personable when you're looking at the bigger advisory firms, where you are getting more tailored approach when you are looking at boutique firms, for sure. Yeah.
No, thanks. Well, it definitely depends, but it's a good statement that even with consulting, like with TMS implementations, it's not always about the big names, the ones with the biggest marketing budgets. We're fighting hard for that at Pecunia as well. You are doing your share, Crystal and Mark, in your markets and with your clients. We ran over a bit, but I wanted to at least have these statements as a final big bang at this webinar. Thanks, Crystal. Thanks, Mark, for contributing to this session. Thanks, audience, for being so active in the chat, asking all these questions. Not only questions, but sharing your knowledge. I see a lot of familiar names there in the chat, so it's great that you joined us. Thanks for making this a great session. Thanks for joining. The recording will be put on YouTube. It will be put on Spotify as soon as possible. And have a look at our next Treasury Masterminds webinars, which are upcoming. It's a bit low in September. There's Eurofinance, there's Treasury 360. It's a bit of a conference month, but we have a lot of upcoming sessions in October, November, and December already planned. Thanks again, Crystal. Thanks again, Mark. And thanks again, audience. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.